Hello, good morning to those of us who are the west of Washington, D.C., and good afternoon to those to our east. Thank you so much for joining today, wherever you are in the world. My name is Randy Bell, and I'm the director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to our 12th event as part of our Raising Ambitions series, which is aimed at highlighting the higher climate ambitions that the Biden administration hopes to realize at home and abroad. The previous 11 events in the series were all in the lead up to this week's climate summit and focused on topics such as offshore wind, hydrogen, and nature-based solutions. We also highlighted several countries that will be crucial actors in meeting global climate goals. You can find all these events and rewatch them on the Atlantic Council website. With the summit now over, the aim of this panel is to get at the key takeaways from the past 2 days and the necessary actions going forward on the road to Glasgow this November. Atlantic Council experts have also given their take on the summit this week, and we're posting that blog in the chat for you to read. That's also on the Atlantic Council website. A quick note before we get started, you can follow us on Twitter at AC Global Energy and use the hashtag Raising Ambitions. Unfortunately for this event, given the number of great speakers we have today in the short amount of time, we're not able to take questions from the audience, but I think you'll get a lot of information out of the conversations that we're about to have. It is now my pleasure, my really distinct pleasure, to introduce Andrew Light, the Acting Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of International Affairs. Andrew is going to make brief remarks on the Department of Energy's accomplishments for the week. And I know I am particularly looking forward to hearing about the Net Zero Producers Forum, which was just announced this morning. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really are glad you're here. This whole week was hugely impressive. Congratulations to you and Secretary Granholm and the entire team at DOE. So Andrew, over to you.
Thanks very much, Randy. I'll try to be brief. There's so much I'd like to say because it was such an incredibly exciting week, and I was there with Secretary Granholm today at the White House when she was, sitting on the stage with our special envoy for climate, John Kerry, and then virtually on the screen we had all the 6 world leaders and many heads of industry and NGOs and Secretary Raimondo moderating a discussion there as well. It was just tremendously excited to see everything that come into this to make it such a big success and all the excitement. And I think today was really, I think yesterday as well was about solutions, but you really saw that just kind of that enthusiasm today that it was about solutions. And that, look, no one has got to, remind any of us that this has been a pretty fraught conversation of how you get countries together to solve this problem, going back to the late 1980s when we started creating the idea of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But I think what really emerged today was a resounding, when you put the 2 sessions together, the innovation session and the economic opportunity session, a resounding sense of it's about the opportunity. It's about the jobs you can create. It's about the sort of driving down the cost of these innovative technologies that will solve the problem, but also put people back to work and do that. So I just want to hit a few points on the DOE deliverables for that. I think, obviously a lot of the main event announcement of the USNDC and the targets we heard from other countries, that was really what brought folks together. But that momentum allowed us to focus in and produce these other deliverables, which you'll see all together later, I believe today on a White House fact sheet that will be then released. There's a top line that you're going to see, and Secretary Granholm talked about it today, which was not a sort of a deliverable, sort of a named new thing we're doing with other countries, but generally speaking about just the focus the administration is going to take on clean energy innovation and manufacturing, which is a giant scale up of the commitment before. And some of the things that Secretary Granholm announced in her speech as part of that will be that coming soon at the Department of Energy, we'll be announcing new goals to try to achieve new leaps in next generation technologies, especially focused on driving down cost. Some of the things that she announced, for example, will be lowering the cost of clean renewable hydrogen by 80% before 2030, making it competitive with natural gas prices, slashing battery cell prices in half, and eliminating the need for critical materials, making EVs, she said, as affordable as gasoline vehicles, and dramatically reducing the cost of industrial and atmospheric carbon capture while ramping up incentives for large scale efforts. So there's a cluster in there that, to be continued. So that's number one. Number two, both Secretary Granholm and the president in those back-to-back sessions talked about these platforms, mission innovation and the clean energy ministerial. Those are the two main platforms that were created under the Obama administration. Clean energy ministerial, more focused on deployment, around 26 countries in the European Union, created by Secretary Chu, and then mission innovation, created by Secretary Moniz, about 24 countries work together on the future-looking innovation side of the question. And so the United States created these, and then frankly has not been terribly engaged the last 4 years. Those are all both going through a big refresh now. They do a joint ministerial this summer that Chile will host. And we announced that we're not only getting back into those in terms of particular platforms, we're joining this summer a platform in mission innovation on shipping. We're going to co-lead it with Denmark on alternative fuels and shipping and decarbonizing the shipping sector. We're joining a new platform on hydrogen as well. And then we're developing our own new platform on carbon dioxide removal with a bunch of parties, including Canada, the Saudis, others that will be announced at the COP in Glasgow in the fall. But most importantly, I think along with that, we're agreed to host, and this is a massive undertaking, will fall mostly on my office, I gotta say, a massive undertaking to host the next Clean Energy Ministerial Combined Mission Innovation Big Summit in 2022. And then that gives us an ability to really shape the post-Glasgow momentum. We're creating all these things. Jesse and his team, and Special Envoy Kerry will be like driving together, all of this stuff coming together. We got to then deliver it. And this will be the delivery side of that. And the United States has just sort of said, we're stepping up, we're volunteer, we're back, we're going to do that. Number three, Randy, for you, the Net Zero Producers Forum. This is very exciting. And so this is the United States, Canada, Norway, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, all agreeing to come together, these oil exporters, big oil producing states, to focus on how can we together, and some of those countries are already there committing to net zero by 2050, some have not yet. And so to really take on the hard questions, starting with things like methane abatement, we all want to do the circular carbon economy approach, which the Saudis got behind for the G20, but also, again, really doing CCS, really focusing on it. And I think one of the most important things, a focus on diversification from reliance on hydrocarbon revenues. Now imagine some of the countries I just mentioned, like what a big commitment that is for them to be having this conversation. And that altogether, those countries are about 40% of global oil and gas production right now. And I think we're going to get a bunch more that will get that well over 50% by the time we have our first organizational meeting in the fall. The fourth thing I want to mention is, and it was all mentioned by Secretary Granholm, we launched the Global Power System Transformation, or GPST Consortium, that was done actually at a side event earlier in the week with the UK's Secretary of State for their energy ministry. And this is really where it's led by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, to really help for power producers around the world, big system operators, Australia, UK, Ireland, United States, all coming together. And in the United States, of course, there's state level operators, right? Especially California, one of the biggest. And then kind of, how do you integrate renewables onto the grid? If we're going to massively scale up, how do you do it? How do you do it without the lights going off? How do you make sure that supply is there, is constant? And then helping other big developing countries like India and others to then help to, learn this as well as they try to do these amazing things like scaling up. Mentioned briefly just a couple of other things. We also announced a new program called the Energy Transitions Initiative Global. This is focused on the islands and the poor parts of the world and the isolated parts of the world. We have a domestic program that we launched to really stabilize renewable energy and such with island states, like especially we focused domestically on Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands following the hurricanes. We're going to make that global and work on all islands. And let me say one last thing, which is not on the fact sheets that we'll see later today, but which was released yesterday, which is we announced a giant, massive new India climate and clean energy agenda for 2030. So this is going to take all the disparate things we've been doing with India over the years, take very seriously their goal of 450 gigawatts by 2030, which Prime Minister Modi reiterated and expanded on yesterday in the second speech of the day. And then we're creating two big working groups under that. One on clean energy cooperation, which was led by Department of Energy, the Department of Petroleum and Natural Gas in India. On the other side, a big piece on climate and finance led by Ashdod Dekar on their side. Really, the opportunity to mention a few of those.
Andrew, thank you so much. It's a remarkable set of accomplishments. One just very brief follow-up question on the Net Zero Producers Forum, since it's something that my team has thought about the role of oil and gas in the energy transition. What are the first immediate action items that you see this group taking to signal to the world how serious you really are?
You're going in and out. I'm sorry, Randy. Can you try?
So what are the first steps that this group is going to take to signal to the world how serious you really are?
Well, first we got to first big meeting, right? So there's been a lot of back and forth just to get the agreed upon text. As you know, these things go. The first big meeting in the fall, we're going to immediately start consolidating and creating platforms on, the stuff that's the obvious first clear thing we're going to do, such as methane abatement in the sector, cleaning up the sector, also working with, I think some of the other countries in the region who have not just yet joined the forum yet, but where you've got a huge problem, right, with just flare gas. And I think as the United States is cleaning up our sector, we've not got the cleanest sector there as well yet, and we want to make it the cleanest in the world, and that's going to actually be a nice counterweight to countries like Russia, which have the dirtiest sector in the world on this, and bring along the other countries there so that we can already compete kind of in that scale. And then I think then we're really going to, I'm not going to pre-announce stuff because we got to get all the parties around the table, see what they want to do. But is it the first play going to be on CCS? Is it going to be on the analysis on diversification? Is it going to be the Saudi idea on circular economy and how you do that? So I don't want to get right out there in front of folks, because this is something we're going to do together cooperatively, and we want to make it a forum where people know they can bring their things so that to the table to get it, so that if we can get other countries in the Gulf region to join, right, we want them to know that's a forum where they will be heard and we can move this thing together.
Andrew, thank you so much. Again, huge accomplishments. What an ambitious agenda. You've got a lot of work cut out in front of you. Do let us know at the Atlantic Council what we can do to play a supporting role on issues where we intersect. Thank you again for joining us today. Go and get some rest. I suspect you've been burning the candle at both ends recently. I want to pass now to Ann Thompson, Chief Environmental Affairs Correspondent at NBC News, to moderate the rest of this event. It's going to begin with a conversation between Ann and Jesse Young, a Senior Advisor on Climate at the U.S. Department of State. So Ann, over to you. And you're on mute.
You know that had to happen sometime during this.
It happens once an event, I assure you. So sorry that it had to happen to you.
Oh, Lord. Anyways, Randy, thank you. It's been a remarkable 2 days. So let's get right to it now that I'm unmuted with Jesse Young. Jesse, first of all, let's talk about the issue of trust, because it's a big issue here with the rest of the countries in the world. I mean, first the U.S. supports keto, then it doesn't. Then it gets into the Paris Agreement, then it gets out, now it's back in. So what kind of skepticism did you face with this dramatic new commitment to reduce emissions by 50 to 52%?
It's a great question, Ann. Thanks for having me, and thanks to you and Randy and Atlantic for inviting us to be here today. It's also a pleasure to follow Andrew, who's a good friend and past, present, and future colleague. I think your question focuses on exactly the right issue, which is U.S. credibility, having sort of seesawed in and out of the Paris Agreement. Help drive the agreement, join it, get out of it, not do much for 4 years, come back in like a gale force wind. I think when we started this process 3 months ago, there was a lot of concern on this front. We wanted to express as much humility as possible, right? A lot of the world has been acting on this front while we have, I think, retreated from the issue set in the last 4 years. So we were worried that we might look presumptuous by trying to sort of visibly lead on climate again at a particular moment like this. Thankfully, I don't think that's been the experience. almost across the board, all regions, all countries, large, small, developed, developing, global south, global north, people are excited to have us back at the table. There really is, at the end of the day, no substitute for US leadership in the way that we can convene countries, drive action, really co-create the global agenda. And so I think people are just really excited to have us back at the table. Now, of course, as others have mentioned, we have to follow up on action now. We've made, I think, a lot of really important, ambitious commitments. We know on the odometer of the car, we know how fast it can go. We need to build the engine and fill it with gas now. We need to take all the attendant actions to actually make that agenda real.
And so given what skepticism there remains, both in the war internationally and in this country, what is it that the Biden administration has to do in the next 3 years to ensure that the United States stays on this path, even if there is a change in administrations?
It's a good question. As Secretary Kerry says, with actions, not with words. So we actually need to start making concrete steps towards meeting that domestic climate commitment we've submitted to the UNFCCC. We submitted our skinny budget to Congress a couple weeks ago, sort of the bare outlines of what we're looking to fund on international climate finance. As everyone here listening knows, a lot of countries want to amp up their ambition on climate, but they lack the in-country capacity, technical, monetary, financial, or otherwise, to do it. And so we want to step forward and be catalytic in that respect. We want to fund a lot of that transition. We want to provide the diplomatic oomph that the United States brings that I was talking about earlier. The summit we had yesterday and today that Andrew is talking about is just the beginning of a process, right? We're teeing up a lot of things that are going to work throughout the year heading into the climate summit, COP26 in Glasgow later this year. So it's not just sort of a question of doing a summit now and sitting on our hands for 6 months. As Andrew was laying out there, and that just dizzying array of wonderful new projects and commitments the US has made with other countries, these are all things we're going to be working on. It's minister-to-minister exchanges, it's technical cooperation, it's going to these countries, it's bringing in research universities, the private sector to make them operative, because we can't do this all on our own. This is never a question just of government action, but it's government as a driver and holding folks accountable for the commitments they've made and enhancing them where we can.
President Biden said that he had hoped this summit, he would see other countries come to the table and ratchet up their ambitions. We saw that from Japan and Canada, but we didn't see that from China and India. How disappointed is the administration in the fact that China and India did not step up their commitments?
I think we were always sanguine about the fact that trying to do a global leader summit within 90 days of taking office provided a pretty limited diplomatic runway to get really big transformative new commitments by the summit. That's why I think Secretary Kerry, my boss, always said, we're going to start the process here to try and generate those commitments by year's end. We are impossibly thankful that Canada stepped up, Japan stepped up. South Korea announced the phase out of international coal finance. A lot of other new climate clean energy partnership with India that Andrew mentioned. But I don't think we were under any illusions that every country was going to come forward with a new Paris target, do or die, by this summit. I don't think that was practical or realistic, especially for countries like China that are just in the process of rolling out their next 5-year plan. These, to use the classic metaphor, a lot of these governments are big tankers, none bigger than us, and it takes time to turn them. And we've basically only had a few weeks to put this all together. So it's going to take more time, I think, to deliver the level of action we want to see out of a lot of these countries, to your question.
Do you think that level of action is possible by Glasgow?
We think so, yeah. It's a question not just of political will, but it's a question of convening. I think we found in going to all these countries, and Secretary Kerry just in the last few days has been to India, China, Bangladesh, UAE, South Korea. When we show up there, we find that a lot of these countries are interested in what we're putting forward, because they're going to see the level of what we put forward to scope what they're going to do. We can lead in that way. A lot of our partners want to know where we're going to be on finance, where we're going to be on climate action, to see if they can match it, if they can beat it. A lot of them would like to beat us if possible, which we fully encourage a race to the top dynamic here. But we are settling back into a role, as Andrew said, that we have largely been absent from for 4 years. So it takes time to sort of to grease the wheels of that process. I don't know how many awkward mechanical metaphors I can fit in here, but I'll try to get a few more.
You're doing well. Let's talk about climate action, because I think in the administration's announcement, it was long on promises and short on specifics. So what is achievable in the next 3 years that really gets jumpstarts the United States to cutting its emissions in half?
Sure. So I think it's important to remember with the target we announced yesterday, the nationally determined contribution, is it's a framework for action. It lays out the big ticket goals we want to set. It spells out some of the tools we're going to use, but it's not supposed to be comprehensive in laying out every rulemaking and every partnership and every new funded project we're going to have. This was the case when the U.S. put out its last target in 2015 before the Paris Agreement, when I was last at the State Department on the Paris team. We leave it to individual agencies to do a lot of this work. You saw pretty much the entire cabinet speaking at the summit over the last few days talking about that work. It's work on EVs and clean transportation at DOE. It's work on the trade agenda and innovation at Commerce. Those secretaries and those departments are going to drive that agenda on their own. It's not for us, National Security Council, Gina McCarthy, John Kerry, me, to spell all of that out. We don't have the manpower, and we are here to encourage and catalyze that work. But it's going to take time. The full budget isn't out yet. There's a lot of work product that is churning in the agencies that just still needs to be articulated and go through legal review and move all that out. We're trying to do this as quickly as possible. Again, with just 90 days prep time, we're hoping to launch all that now that we've gotten the summit and the target and the finance plan out.
And Jesse, just let me close with this. What is the reaction to Brazil's proposal that the United States give it $1 billion and it will cut deforestation by 40%? Does that have any traction? Is the LEAF Coalition in any way a response to that?
It's also a good question. I think, as Kerry has said on this topic, we are encouraged to see Brazil's moves on this front, but we need to see it backed up by actual enforcement and action. It is very good to set these targets, as is the case for us. We need to see measurable progress towards them. Obviously, I think Brazil has a ways to go on this issue. We'd like to partner with them, but only if they're going to be a good faith actor in this regard, and we certainly hope that's the case.
Jesse, thank you for taking time to talk to us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Good luck.
And now we're going to move on to get the perspectives of Daniel Goldwyn and Michael Steele on just what cutting carbon emissions in half by the end of the decade means. David Goldwyn, I apologize, is the chairman of the Atlantic Council's Energy Advisory Group, and Michael Steele is the former chairman of the Republican National Committee, and as I like to say, he is an MSNBC contributor, because that's how I know him. David and Michael, welcome. First of all, for both of you, put a percentage on it. What do you think the chances are of the United States actually cutting its emissions in half by the end of this decade?
I'd give it a 70% chance of success. And I say that for four reasons. I think the first is that most of what's sought is technologically possible. We know how to do the power emission reductions, 30 gigawatts of wind, increasing and scaling up renewables, increasing storage. Transportation, the big companies, the auto companies are already going to electric vehicles. That's going to come in the second half of that decade. But we know how to do that. Carbon sequestration. There's a lot of cost reduction that has to happen, but I think that part is realistic. The second reason I think it's realistic is that it's politically adept and savvy. This legislation package is designed for Joe Manchin. So there we're talking about carbon sequestration. No one's talking about zeroing out coal. No one's talking about abandoning internal combustion engines, and the tools, direct pay, tax incentives. These are business driving frameworks. I think the third reason is that it's flexible. There's a legislative pathway. There's an executive order pathway. There's a hope from the market to pick up pathways. So there's a lot of ways to get there. And finally, I would say because we're operating off a really strong base, industry is already moving, hundreds of companies have net zero targets, unions are moving, states and localities are moving on this. The ESG requirements and the SEC rules and climate disclosure will impact capital allocation. So you're not lifting off from ground zero, you're building on an existing movement. So for all of that, I think I'd give it a 70% chance of getting there. It is really ambitious, but I think we can get there.
Michael, what's your percentage?
Yeah, so I love David. David just laid it out, and it's smart, and that 70% is a real number. But I live in Washington D.C., right? And at the end of the day, it's going to take two sides to tango on climate, and I would put that number at about 50%. And the reason I would is largely on one word, because of one word, leadership. Now, what I loved about what I heard both from Mr. Light and Mr. Young was, we're back, baby. We're back. We're back in the climate game. We're back at the table. We're in the room. And that's because the president has come forward with a vision, for sure, with goals, absolutely, and with the kind of leadership that it's going to take to move some mountains in DC. And those mountains largely rest on my side of the aisle, on the Republican side of the aisle. There's no doubt about that. But there is space. Republicans are beginning to see the trend lines here with 300 companies just this week, major players, Google, Apple, et cetera, coming out and saying in a letter publicly, we want this. We want to move in this direction. We're taking the necessary steps. You're beginning to see leadership emerge from industry, which is important. The political leadership is going to follow that. That's how it works. That's how it always works. But what's interesting here is that part of that political leadership, at least initially, has come from the White House. And I think to David's point, given the 4 points that he laid out, there's a real pathway forward now, which is exciting, it's important. And to that sentiment, we're back, baby. I think it's going to be an enormously interesting and relevant driver going into 2022, particularly with a lot of the net zero conversation, et cetera, standing right in front of us.
But Michael, yesterday we heard from both Leader McConnell and Senator Barrasso, the sort of same old words out of the GOP playbook, reacting to the emissions cut, saying it will kill jobs and it will hurt the United States internationally. I mean, are they just out of step? When are they going to follow the lead of business?
Yeah, they are out of step. There's no doubt about it. As I noted, you've already got major corporate players, both domestic and international, coming to this space. Glad to see the U.S. back engaged. The typical, tried and true language and lines that come from the GOP on this. Expect that's going to happen. But it's what's going on behind the scenes, how the administration begins to network with individual senators and Congress members to get them in closer to the space. And a lot of that's going to be driven, as we've seen on some of the more touchy and difficult social issues and justice issues playing out right now in the United States. Businesses is beginning to step in and beginning to step up. And I think to the extent that they begin to put that sort of private pressure on the GOP to come around, I think you'll see that. Right now, what McConnell and Barrasso said, I fully would have expected. I would have been shocked if they said anything else. Let's put it that way. So no one should have their alarms go off. No one should have hair on fire. And that's, saying something for someone like myself. When you hear, this leadership come out and take the standard talking points and start checking them off, that's just noise. What you got to look at is how the administration is going to drive this, and then who, whether in business or politics, gets behind them.
David, you said that this was a plan tailor-made for Joe Manchin, who is the Democratic senator from West Virginia. And you talked about carbon sequestration and storage, or carbon capture and sequestration and storage. But I mean, the reality is that it's still incredibly expensive and does not seem anywhere close to being a reality. Can the U.S. genuinely cut its emissions by 50% without carbon capture and sequestration?
No, carbon capture and sequestration is really essential, and it's interesting how much it is front and center to the Biden plan and to the NDC, because they speak of leveraging the carbon pollution-free energy potential of power plants retrofitted with carbon capture, as well as existing nuclear, and also the 10 pioneer projects, which are going to use essentially hydrogen to decarbonize, major industrial centers like refining centers. So I think you can't get there without carbon capture, but I think there are really smart strategies to get there with carbon capture, and this is essentially making carbon capture a business. And so expansion of 45Q to give both money or even direct pay to companies that are capturing this is how you're going to make this a business. And I think it's a combination of regulation, which is going to require emissions reduction, and incentives for people to capture that carbon and to move the CO2 that's really going to drive this. And this is what the major companies are actually quite excited about is having carbon capture not be a regulatory requirement, but to have carbon capture be a business. And so if government sends the signal that you've got to sequester it, they're going to be in the business of capturing it efficiently, burying it underground, recycling it, finding other purposes for it. And I think that's why it's so front and center. And you've got the SCALE Act and others, which talks about 4 or 5 different ways which you can use R&D and you can use incentives in order to try and drive that business.
Michael, would that be palatable to Leader McConnell and Senator Barrasso?
Yeah, I think in the main it would be, but what David has just outlined and what we have seen and discussed over the last couple of days, the bottom line still remains cost. How do these pieces come together? What kind of cost? And for McConnell and a lot of Republicans, that's always the go-to driver in when you get into this industry, when you start talking about the various strategies to deal with climate, it always comes back to cost. And when you look at the goals that are set out, you're looking at, just in some, small end projections of $570 billion a year additional to phase out a lot of the remaining coal plants and to do a lot of the sort of infrastructure related things that you need to do. And so if, Republicans right now are carping about the fact that the Biden administration wants to spend $2.1 trillion on infrastructure, which includes some of these features, right? Among other things. And they're coming back with a very narrowly tailored plan. When it comes to this specific area, that's going to be a real concern and a real stumbling block. But it doesn't ultimately have to be, because again, wrapping back around the business, I think the business community is ready to help lead in this space and begin to do some of the things from the private sector side to sort of help the government offset some of those longer term expenses on an annualized basis by advancing on technologies and working with state governments, by the way, which are going to be essential players here in this space, not just on the West Coast, not just in those West leading states, but places like the South and the Northeast as well. And I think that will be how you begin to get around some of those corners.
So our final question, where is the common ground for congressional Democrats and Republicans to agree and help reach this goal of cutting emissions by 50%?
I think there's a lot of common ground. Carbon capture and sequestration, John Barrasso is going to love that. If you're in Wyoming, South Dakota, Texas, Oklahoma, you're going to like the idea there's loans, R&D for that. I think, in jobs and infrastructure, building ports, building transmission across these states, and enabling the wind provinces in the Midwest and in Texas to be able to sell electricity to the East Coast and California. There's money for everybody in there. Frankly, the return of earmarks in an infrastructure bill means there's literally something for everyone, who votes for that bill. And I'd be astonished to see the Republicans walk away from the ability to have 10 projects of their own for each piece of the bill. So I think, and driving the jobs, as Michael pointed out, the fact that you have industry, behind this is huge. So take the auto industry, building a new generation of electric vehicles. That's auto parts in Indiana, your home state, and also in Ohio and for Michigan. And there's an enormous value chain, frankly, broader with electric vehicles than it was in traditional vehicles, because you've got the software companies too. So I think there's common ground in carbon capture, in transmission, in electricity, in renewables, in those union jobs, in the R&D, in the money for universities. And I think that's a lot of common ground.
Michael?
I think David laid it out. I really can't advance much more on that. I mean, he touched on all the key elements, but I will single out one that I think I just put a peg in it for everybody to watch this space, and that's earmarks. While the U.S. is back in the climate game, earmarks are coming back to Congress. And I think that changes a lot of how the members, irrespective of their leadership and sometimes, hand in hand with their leadership, kind of move forward on these otherwise prickly political and legislative issues. So watch how earmarks shape the climate debate and shape climate legislation, because now every member has got something to play with and to play for.
Michael and David, it's always interesting to hear your perspectives. And most of all, what I really enjoy is your honesty on this issue. Thank you very, very much.
Thank
Now
you.
we're going to move on and take a look at the international commitments that were made or not made during the Global Climate Summit. And joining our discussion now are Bosco Marti. He is the Senior Fellow with the Atlantic Council, Latin American Center, Akshat Rathi, who covers science, energy, and the environment for Bloomberg, Tao Wang, who is the Climeworks China specialist, and Lydia Boital, who belongs to the International Network of Energy Transition Think Tanks. At this moment, the US is patting itself on the back for getting back into the climate fight. But do other nations trust America to stay in? Or are they prepared for what could be another case of climate whiplash come 2024 if there is a change in administrations? Lydia, give us the perspective from Europe.
Thank you, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to this very fresh event after the summit. It has just finished, and I had the pleasure to listen to all of it. And what I can say is that the EU is definitely thrilled to see the US back leading the efforts on the domestic but also international stage. We've been longing for such a partner because back in 2019 we have announced the European Green Deal, and since then there was some major developments such as the adoption of climate neutrality target by 2050, and quite recently also the enhancement of our 2030 goal. So we are now going to reduce emissions by 55%. But obviously no country can do it alone, and I've heard this several times during the summit as well. So we will be looking at the US to maintain its promises. And obviously there are no guarantees. No one can guarantee that the US will stay in, but what we can hope is that all these voices that have been expressing so far will be saying, well, the investment in innovation, in jobs, in technology will present itself as opportunity to any next administration in the US. The economic partnership, the partnerships with various countries, also the diplomatic ones. I think this is something that once it moves, and I really enjoyed the oiling metaphor, it will be hard to stop even after 2025. So obviously to gain even more trust, we would like to see that these plans, that these strategies are being implemented, and that would mean we would like to see we need to see a critical amount of investments, but also legislation. And we know that passing through a legislation is no small feat. When we are now sitting in June as the European Union to see how different sectors will need to contribute to this enhanced target for 55% until 2030. We have 27 member states, each with different capacities and possibilities to implement this target, and we will have to discuss how to best do it. So I guess a kind of a similar process will then be implemented in the US to see how the US, both as a country and as separate states, are going to make this target achievable. And I'm taking on the percentages expressed in the previous session. I will keep them dear in heart, and hopefully in 10 years we will be able to assess how much this has been true.
Tao, I think there's as much skepticism as there is about whether the US will actually live up to its commitments. There's also a lot of skepticism about China. President Xi says that China will reduce its coal consumption starting in 2025, and yet we see that China is building more coal plants than the world is retiring. So why should the world have any kind of confidence that China is going to start to decrease its reliance on coal starting in 2025?
Thank you, Anne, for the questions, and thanks to Atlantic Council for the invitations to participate into this very exciting discussion. First of all, I think we are very glad to see US back into the game. And you just had a very exciting discussion with Jess about how US has a trust issue to overcome to the international communities. And I think there's also a similar obstacle that China has to overcome, which is China has historically a tendency of making relatively conservative promises, but always overshooting it. So in the last decades, even without very ambitious targets, in the international standard, China emerged as the leaders of the renewable technologies and low carbon investment. And you have heard a lot from these countries why this is already becoming concerning for the industries in United States. But we have also seen a lot of changes recently, and especially since last September, when President Xi Jinping announced what we call now 30-60 target, which means China will peak the carbon emission by 2030 and reach the net zero carbon neutralities by 2060. And a lot of those targets this is actually a very ambitious target, surprised many of the climate policy observers and also researchers in China. So I don't see that China is actually not making new plan. And as you mentioned earlier, it's actually more of the specifics of how we are going to achieve these ambitious goals. This is, of course, no deniable that there has been a lot of challenges in China, because you have to remember China is a large and vast country with a huge populations. And despite China has already been the world's largest wind solar installations and also the largest sales of the EVs and all the others very exciting titles, China still has over 70% of the energy mix coming out from the fossil fuels, and coal is the major one. So the transition is going to be very tough. It's very hard fight, and we have to keep pushing for it. There is no denying that this recent wave of constructions of coal-fired power plant is a bit concerning to many of us. China is having about 50 gigawatts of the coal-fired power plant under constructions, and another 50 gigawatt that is in the pipeline. And this majority of that is actually pushed by the local government and local industries as a response to their post-pandemic economic recoveries. So that is the way, actually, you can see how strong the traditional tendency of the old economy path that China is still clinging on, and especially down to the local level, trying to revive their economy, trying to keep their jobs and revenues and keep people's lights on. But we have to also push them to actually getting into the more cleaner choices. And there is a lot for the international community to do. And China also has a huge battle to fight against it. And we have a lot of domestic challenges going on. For example, the aging societies and also the economy slowing down. The pie is not growing as fast as before. So there are also rising costs and more challenging domestic issues to address. But fortunately, we have seen that the leadership has committed very strongly and resolute on this commitment that China is going to peak the carbon emissions. And you have just mentioned that President Xi mentioned that China is going to peak the coal emissions by 2025. That is also the first time that we have heard clear signal that China is going to see coal reduction from 2025. And that is going to send a lot of signals and a chain of changes within China's policy makings and investment decisions and industry's response. So I think this is something we really, for this summit, I think it's a huge opportunity for us to see the world is moving together to, again, committed to some changes and also to deliver that. And we have lost a lot of time in the past. And this is not a time for us to resent, and we need to push for this green competition among China, EU, US, and all the partners in the world. And that is a game on.
Tao, just quickly, do you expect China to increase its ambitions before Glasgow, to make a bigger commitment to reduce its emissions before we get to Glasgow?
Thank you for pointing out that. And in fact, I think China just announced the enhanced NDC by the end of last year, and including some of the enhanced renewable energy investment targets. And I believe this is a very strong commitment, but many of us within China are still talking within China and also working with Chinese government are still arguing for even higher targets for renewables and quicker transitions and higher investment into, for example, electric vehicles, CCUS and green hydrogen, etc. And the recent joint statement between China and the US on the climate crisis also lists out a few areas, and we are going to collaborate closely to pushing for those changes. So I have very strong positive hope that we will see more targets and more detailed action plan coming out.
Tao, thank you. Bosco, a lot of the talk this week has been about Brazil's offer or to say, look, we'll reduce deforestation in the Amazon by 40% if the US will give us $1 billion. Is this the beginning of what I would call climate blackmail?
Thank you very much for the question and for the opportunity to be here in this panel. First of all, I would say that it's very encouraging to see the US retaking that leadership position that they once had and starting to work very diligent on that. I'd say that yesterday's announcement by the US saying that they intend to double by 2024 annual public climate finance to developing countries and to triple adaptation finance sent a very timely and constructive message. As you know, not all countries have the same fiscal space to carry out the necessary investments to increase resilience and drastically reduce emissions as required by the Paris Agreement. For climate action to really boost cooperation actions is a must. Global environmental institutions like the Green Climate Fund and the GEF are in need of sufficient and predictable sources of funding. Considering how countries have been economically impacted by COVID, financial cooperation for climate action is in the mind of many developing countries, and I think it was reflected on the interventions that we saw yesterday. Having said that, I believe that in the case of Brazil, it was quite encouraging to see President Bolsonaro announce what has been his most ambitious environmental goal yet, saying that the country would reach emissions neutrality by 2050 and pledge to double funding environmental enforcement. We still need to follow up very closely its budget process to see how Brazil would pay for that additional enforcement, and they're right now in that process. So I think that's something that needs to be followed very closely. So in summary, I'd say that it's a mix. Obviously. International cooperation, especially by the specialized agencies to developing countries, is very important, but it's also quite important for countries to do what they can do and really act, and it's the time to do it right now. Thank you.
Is trust the big issue with Brazil and Bolsonaro in particular?
Well, I'd say that trust, it's something really that is in everybody's mind, not only in Brazil but in general in the different countries. I mean, we've seen how countries have committed to some concrete actions, and when government changes, the new presidents have different views. So in this sense, I would say that the most important thing would be to try to put the appropriate checks and balances to make sure that whatever commitment is done is being followed through, and that there's a concrete action plan to achieve this. So one thing is seeing the goals and the ambitious numbers. Another one is seeing the specifics on how to reach that.
Mm-hmm. Bosco, thank you. Akshat, let's talk about India, because Prime Minister Modi says, look, India is doing all it can in its effort to move to renewables, yet still 70% of India's power comes from coal. So how does India move away from coal, given the powerful coal lobby in that country?
Well, the powerful coal lobby is almost all government owned, because Coal India is a public company, but the largest shareholder is the Indian government. And so, the coal lobby is not as strong as you would have thought of the coal lobby in the US in the 1990s, for example, where you had private companies lobbying the government. if the government decides that it wants to move away from coal, it has the ability to do so. Of course, it will have to do that while keeping in mind that regions in the country, many regions in the country, depend on coal. And so any transition away has to be managed. Now, we are now talking at a time when the COVID pandemic has hit India particularly hard, perhaps the hardest that any country has been hit by COVID. And it is exposing what are the problems for a developing country, which is one of governance and of industrial development and of economic development. COVID has been a problem for a lot of countries, but in India, you've had problems with basic healthcare infrastructure, not enough beds, not enough oxygen. That is going to be a problem if you're going to transition from polluting sources to clean sources, if you don't have the infrastructure available to be able to make that transition and have the economic advantage of a growing economy to make the move. So I think India, and I think in some way India represents more of the developing world in this regard, will have a challenge to be able to meet climate goals while managing real basic economic development that it has to get on with.
So let's do one final question for each of you. We'll call this the lightning round. And that is simply the Biden administration was hoping that the rest of the world would step up in a powerful way to increase their reductions in emissions at this summit. Should the Biden administration be disappointed in what happened or what didn't happen at this summit? Bosco, let's start with you.
Thank you. I think that there is certainly more room for more ambition, but I think that what was announced yesterday by many of the countries is a positive step forward. No, there are still, as I mentioned earlier, we need to see how these commitments are going to be translated into action plans and specific things to start working on that. But I'd say that it's a very positive first step forward on that direction.
Lydia, should the Biden administration be encouraged or disappointed?
Encouraged. When I've heard exactly this is what I thought, the first 3 months, and you already have some major economies coming with new targets. And for anyone who ever worked in the climate policy space, it is obvious that these things don't happen overnight. So apparently the push has been strong enough to distill some of these more important and pledges at this summit. And we still have a way to go to COP26. We have at least a few months for the global leaders to step up with their commitments. That's one thing, but there also have been some promises made, and we are, for example, waiting for Korea to update its NDC. And I think these will be coming. And we have to also remember that not every country was present at the summit. So let's see what the other leaders will develop in anticipation of having them highlighted at the next summit this year.
Akshat, disappointed or encouraged?
I think encouraged because everybody did come. Everybody who was invited came. And we also, apart from the commitments that were made, there were other initiatives. So one that we didn't talk about is India and the US have created a clean energy innovation platform, which could become a model for how technologies developed in the West make their way into developing countries. And that is an encouraging sign because we need a lot of that to happen very quickly.
Tal, the last word goes to you.
Thank you, Anne. I think we are actually in the testing time of the world, and especially the relation between US and China. So the announcement of the joint statement between US and China, the successful outcome of the summit, and also including the video calls between France, Germany, and China, announced a lot of new targets, including the non-CO2s and also the ratification of Kigali and also the peak of the coal. That has been very positive signals that read across the world for whoever cares about what is going on between US and China, and also the international collaborations on climate change. So I think this is really encouraging. And as I said, this is a huge program that we are trying to put out, and the US put out a very big program, China put out a ground targets, and we are expecting them to deliver more and more specific steps and also targets about what they are going to achieve in the coming months and years. But this is the decade of make or break it. So we definitely have no way back, and we have to make it happen. So it is encouraging, and I remain optimistic about outcome.
Panelists, thank you one and all. To sum up these extraordinary 2 days, we are now going to turn to Francesco LaCamera, who is the Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency, and Rachel Kite, who is the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Rachel and Francesco, welcome. First of all, to both of you, how do the last 2 days set the table for COP26?
I'm sure Rachel has to be first. She's a woman. She will never forgive me. You know, if I will start talking first, she will never forgive me.
Oh, please, Francesco, as the Director General, we need to hear from you.
No, absolutely.
Well, I think that it's a very important year, and this was a very important start of the rhythm of the diplomacy for the rest of the year. And the centerpiece was the US plan. Without that, all the other things that have to happen this year was just going to be more and more difficult. So the US is now there with a plan. So we have the vast majority of the world's GDP now covered with a 2050 net zero promise, and the tighter and tighter 2030 commitments were not there. The private sector ambition is getting there. The financial sector shift is getting there. As Senator Kerry said, you know, no politician can stand in the way of this thing now. It's moving, but we're not on track. And so the question is, can we ratchet up? And there's one big piece that was missing, really, which is the kind of financial commitments that are necessary for adaptation and resilience in poor countries in the world to help the energy transition happen globally, and the kinds of sort of handshake between China, the US, and the EU that's going to be essential on trade. It's going to be essential on how the financial sector regulates itself, etc. So there's lots of pieces that have to fall into place at the G7 in Cornwall, at the G20, organised by the Italians, and then in the run-up to the climate summit in Glasgow. So a good first step, some essential components coming into focus, as was said in the last panel, but still a long way to go.
Francesco?
Naturally, all Rachel says, I agree with that. And if I can say 2 points that I think are important also in my point of view, is one is the fact that this event showed that the multilateralism is still there. And in some way, the climate change themes as be considered in some way special and out of the ordinary international relationship. And I think this is a very, very good result. The other result, naturally, we are not yet there, but at least the commitments coming from the major polluters are in line for let the doors to the 1.5 still open. Naturally, we have to see what the other countries are going to commit before the COP26 or in COP26. Naturally, as has been said, the financial part has been not focused enough, but this was just the case because there we were looking more for the political commitment. There is the relationship between investment and policies needed was not there. There was no mention about the markets and how the actual markets are structured for providing for an acceleration of the energy transition. And then I think that the leaders of the G20, so Italy, the leaders of COP26, the high-level dialogue on energy work has to connect in some way together and try, my point of view, also to make the COP26 to abandon the old fashion to be concentrating on negotiating text but to moving more on showcase the best example and trying to make people share experience, having the private world into the COP and trying to see what is the best follow-up for implementing all these promises.
Rachel, you mentioned it in your comments that despite the Paris Agreement, the world is moving in the wrong direction when it comes to emissions. Did you see anything in the past 2 days that would suggest that we can reverse that trend?
Well, yes, because, well, first of all, I think the last panel talked about some of the mood music between China and the US in the run-up to the summit. And then I think, the first sort of concrete mentioning by the Chinese around phasing out coal. We also saw earlier in the week an announcement from the People's Bank of China that they're going to not include coal in some of their definitions of green bonds, and there's a sort of general beginning of the move away from coal there as well. We've got a climate law now agreed within the European Union. So and we've got an infrastructure bill and a jobs bill, on the table in the United States. So the question now is harnessing the financial sector so that it continues to drive for green, and that it continues to drive companies towards green. You've now set the guardrails with public policy. The guardrails are that this is where we need to be by 2050, and this is how fast we have to get to 2030. So now public policy can start to try to incentivize even faster the private sector to move there. The problem is that we've got to bring everybody along. So there are still countries where we don't really know where they stand. We've got deeply energy inefficient economies like Iran. We've got Russia that still believes it's going to benefit in the short run from climate change, which I think the science wouldn't support. So there's only one planet, so the rising tide has to lift all boats. But now we have to unleash the financial sector and the business sector. And this is where Janet Yellen becomes the most significant Secretary of the Treasury in modern history, because she is climate smart and she has the ability to pull across the federal government many, many different levers. And in cooperation with the European Union, in cooperation with China and others, we have an opportunity to start changing get under the hood of the global economy and start changing the rules upon which we understand value.
One of the things I was struck by yesterday was Citigroup CEOs saying that, one of the questions they're asking their clients are, what are you doing to create an emissions reduction plan? And, are those goals aligned with Citigroup's larger goals to reduce emissions? And if they aren't, maybe we should take a second look at that. Is that the kind of, overall connection that you're talking about between what the private sector is doing and what governments are trying to do?
Yeah, so you're going to see asset owners. So these are the people who own your pension and mine and own the sort of future wealth of society, saying we do not want to be invested in companies or in products and services which are going to have diminished value over the next 10 to 20 years because we are decarbonising. So they're going to take a dim view of any company that can't tell you how it's going to manage its own business through this process of decarbonisation. That has a knock-on effect to banks, to asset managers, to the insurance companies are reappraising how they will look at this, and reinsurers as well. So this knock-on effect is happening. And so wherever you are in a global supply chain, you're going to have to be able to tell an investor, a banker, or a government very soon how you are going to manage your business in a decarbonising decade. And now there's a lot of greenwashing going on out there. So the thing to look for in the next 6 to 9 months is a tightening up of what does it mean to say that you're net zero if you're a bank or an insurer or an asset manager or an asset owner or a company? How can you show it? How transparent will you be? Who are you reporting to? So that will all get tightened down. And I think you're going to see some naming and shaming going on. You're already seeing activist investors like Chris Hone in London sort of saying, I'm going to work to remove directors from boards if they are not acting as climate citizens, as independent directors on boards. And you're going to see a big knock-on effect, I think, from that kind of activism.
Francesco, you have written that this energy transition that we are in is unstoppable. But back to carbon capture and sequestration, we've heard a lot about that in the last 2 days. Is that genuinely feasible? Could we see that technology be scalable by the end of the decade?
So this is a very difficult question, but I wish to respond. very clearly, we don't consider the CCS or CCUS a clean technology. CCS and CCUS are a way to retrofit the existing fossil fuel plants. The fact is that the CCS, CCUS exist already for more than 10 years, but we have assisted that many of these plants have been closed because they are completely uneconomical. Mm-hmm. But if you allow me, and I wish to add something on what Rachel just said, that Please. The way the bank are acting is not just a question of a moral engagement or a way to contribute to the decarbonization of the system. The fact is that the bank doesn't want to give money to a client. They may be the strength asset of the future. So we have to start from the point of view that renewables are the most economic way to produce electricity today. So this has been acknowledged by the bank. If you have seen this day, or possibly you have learned as a 3 major bank has retired the interest to finding a gas pipeline in Africa, 1,200 kilometer pipeline. This was for moral circumstances? No, because I think that that investment was going to be uneconomical soon. And on this, I wish to do a less comments, so because I wish also Rachel had the chance to comment on this. The US has been very clear and say, this is an economical opportunity. And this is what I'm just trying to say. And will create jobs and good jobs. The other fact they say, and what we are trying as ARENA to repeat day by day, that the next decade will say very clear to us if we'll be ready to achieve the carbon neutrality in the half of the century. So this decade is decisive. So technologies that cannot be rolled out in time for this. So nuclear is out over 10 years time. CCS and CCUS are largely out of this 10 years time. So we have to go, and we have the technologies already here to build as much as possible new renewable plants, make the green hydrogen be competitive as soon as possible. And just think about this, Anne. Important think tank say that green hydrogen was going to be competitive in 2050. This was the last summer. Now they say that it will be in 2030. There are companies that are ready to say that will be competitive in 2025. So this is just element that I'm sure Rachel will be happy to go in deeper.
I apologize for this. We are just about out of time, but just give me the one thing you were going to look for in Glasgow that will determine the success or failure of that meeting. Rachel, is it financing?
Yeah, I mean, politically, we have small economies and big economies, but everybody's got to be moving along together, and we can't leave people behind. So there has to be a very robust financial package in Glasgow.
And Francesco?
What Rachel say in the framework of raising ambition and looking more on implementation than just on providing for new declaration to be there on paper.
Yeah. It kills me to say goodbye because I could ask questions all day to both of you, and in fact, all our panelists. But thank you very much. And thank you everyone for, I think, what was a lively and certainly a thought-provoking discussion. Brandy, let me send it back to you.
And thank you so much. Thanks so much for moderating the four great conversations that we had today, each really interesting and compelling in their own right. If you had to give us a few takeaways from the summit, but also from this event, what do you think those would be?
I think that what I am hearing today is that there is hope to actually reach these targets. There's certainly energy to reach these targets. The question is, will there be action? And that action depends on money and it depends on political will. It seems I mean, I've been covering this. I can remember when I was in Copenhagen, and that was the world's last best chance to save itself. I mean, here we are many years later, and we're still talking about that. The question is, can the political will and the money come together to really make a difference? Randy?
Yeah, it seems like if there is a moment to act, it is now. The politics, the winds are all aligning. If we can just, the world can just get its act together, now is the time. So thank you, Anne. Thank you again for this. Really, really appreciate your joining us. I want to thank all the panelists who joined us today and everyone in the audience. I'd also like to thank all my colleagues who helped put this event together today, including Zeynep Wiranen and Roger Morales. I'd also like to thank David Goldwyn for coming up with the idea for the Raising Ambition series and encouraging Global Energy Center to do it. I want to thank the entire Global Energy Center team and the Atlantic Council events team for putting together these 12 events over a very short period of time. And I want to give a particular shout out to John Suin for coordinating the entire series. John, thank you so much. I know it was a lot, but just in case you were worried, the Raising Ambition series is not yet done. We have another follow-on event that's put together by the Atlantic Council Africa and South Asia Centers on African and South Asian perspectives on the climate summit. That's next Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern. You can find out more on the Atlantic Council website. And for those of you who are following the hydrogen conversation, which was raised a lot during this event, this Tuesday at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, we'll be hosting Amanda Simpson from Airbus for an Innovation Stream episode on Airbus's plans for a hydrogen-powered airplane. I hope to see you at both of these upcoming events. Until then, thank you again for joining us, and we hope everyone has a great weekend.